Hello, everyone, and thank you for clicking on the Just Love in Person Sunday message. In celebration of the Christmas season, we're going to do something a little differently than normal. Our message is entitled Understanding the Prophecies. Jesus is the Answer. But it's going to take some time to completely work through that topic. So today is week 1 of a 3-week-long message. So you're going to have to stay tuned and stay in tune over the course of these 3 weeks to reach the conclusion of the message. Now, the scriptures we're working with are 3 prophecies found in the book of Isaiah, which we as Christians traditionally interpret to be speaking about the birth and the work of the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth. So we're going to examine these 3 prophecies to see what they're really saying, how we can confidently understand them, and ultimately what they mean for us in our lives. The first prophecy is Isaiah 7:14 through 17. It reads, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel," which means God with us. "He will be eating curds and honey when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. For before the boy knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, the land of the 2 kings you dread will be laid waste. The Lord will bring on you and on your people and on the house of your father a time unlike any since Ephraim broke away from Judah. He will bring the king of Assyria." The second prophecy is Isaiah 9:1 through 2 and 6 through 7. And they read, "Nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who were in distress. In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the future, he will honor Galilee of the nations, by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this." And the third prophecy is Isaiah 11:1 through 4 and 10 through 13. And it reads, "A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots a branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, the Spirit of the knowledge and fear of the Lord, and he will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes, or decide by what he hears with his ears, but with righteousness he will judge the needy. With justice he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth. With the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. In that day the root of Jesse will stand as a banner for the peoples. The nations will rally to him, and his resting place will be glorious. In that day the Lord will reach out his hand a second time to reclaim the surviving remnant of his people from Assyria, from Lower Egypt, from Upper Egypt, from Cush, from Elam, from Babylonia, from Hamath, and from the islands of the Mediterranean. He will raise a banner for the nations and gather the exiles of Israel. He will assemble the scattered people of Judah from the 4 quarters of the earth. Ephraim's jealousy will vanish, and Judah's enemies will be destroyed. Ephraim will not be jealous of Judah, nor Judah hostile toward Ephraim." To understand these 3 prophecies, we must start with their backgrounds. First, we understand that they are the prophecies of the great prophet Isaiah. Isaiah was the first of the 4 major prophets, which include Jeremiah, Daniel, and Ezekiel. They are all called major prophets in Christian scholarship solely because their books were much longer than the 12 other Old Testament books named for prophets. Isaiah lived during the time that Israel was divided. As we remember, during Solomon's son Rehoboam's reign, Israel split. The 9 northern tribes plus Simeon in the south separated from the southern tribes of Benjamin and Judah, creating 2 kingdoms. The northern kingdom, which was called Israel or Ephraim, and the southern kingdom, which was called Judah. Judah was the rightful kingdom because the kings were supposed to come from the tribe of Judah. David and his son Solomon descended from Judah, and all the rightful kings of Israel were to come out of that lineage. Also, Jerusalem, the capital city that David had created, and the temple that Solomon built there were located in the southern kingdom of Judah. So Judah was the legitimate kingdom in God's eyes. The northerners were still a part of God's people in that they were Israelites, but they were out of line because they had false kings reigning over them, and they were disconnected from the place of worship, which was the temple in Jerusalem. Isaiah, in his role as a prophet, was an advisor to the kings of Judah. Again, the rightful kings. He served Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. So 4 generations of Judahite kings. And the themes of Isaiah's prophetic preaching and writings were northern Israel's sins and due punishment, Judah's sins and due punishment, because you have to understand both kingdoms have fallen into idolatry at this time. The northerners were much more further along in their sin than the southerners because they were disconnected from Yahweh and from the temple, but the southerners weren't too far behind. So both groups needed to be chastised by God, and Isaiah prophesied judgment on both of them. He also prophesied of a mysterious figure who would save all of Israel, both the northerners and the southerners, from their sufferings and their sins, and reunite them in a peaceful kingdom. And lastly, Isaiah prophesied the end of days, when God would bring an end to all sinfulness, fighting, and pain for the whole entire world. Now, after we understand who the writer of these prophecies was, we must also understand the context of these prophecies. These 3 prophecies are all interconnected. They are part of a larger 4-chapter long declaration that God gave to Isaiah about the future of Israel. In chapter 7, where we see the first of our 3 prophets, Isaiah is now under the employ of his 3rd king, King Ahaz. Now, Ahaz was not a good king. He was a very wicked king. In fact, only a few kings of Judah were called good kings by God, and none of the kings of northern Israel were called good kings because they were all illegitimate. But Ahaz was one of the many southern kings who did wicked in God's sight because Ahaz was an idol worshiper. But God was patient with him because Israel was God's chosen people, and Ahaz was the rightful king of all Israel and was the reigning king of Judah. And that's an example of the faithfulness of God and his grace and mercy toward us, that he holds back some of the negative things that we deserve and blesses us in ways that we definitely don't deserve. Now, chapter 7 starts off by telling us that northern Israel, which had always been jealous of Judah, was making threats of war against Judah. And northern Israel had linked up with a neighboring kingdom called Aram, which is modern-day Syria. Aram and northern Israel decided that they were going to invade Judah, ostensibly murder and enslave most of the people, which was the normal behavior of conquest, divide the land among themselves, and install a puppet king to do their bidding. In other words, there would have been no more Judah after they got done with it. And you have to understand, this was normal for that time and area. Much of what we know today as the Middle East was part of a region called Mesopotamia, and more broadly an area known as the Fertile Crescent. Within the Fertile Crescent were ancient empires like Egypt, Assyria, which is in modern-day Turkey, Babylonia, which is modern-day Iraq, Persia, which is modern-day Iran, along with many other powerhouse kingdoms like the Akkadian Empire and to a lesser degree, Israel. And the goal of these kingdoms was empire building, seeking to control the areas around them. And for a few, like the Assyrians, Babylonians, and Persians, the goal was to control the whole region itself. So these nations would conquer each other. And those nations that could not conquer on their own would link up with another nation to try to build joint empires. So northern Israel decided to link up with Aram to conquer Judah, their own kinsman. And the prospects of all of this had Ahaz and all of Judah shaking with fear. But God sent the prophet Isaiah to Ahaz to calm his fears and offer him reassurance. Isaiah told Ahaz in verses 7 through 9, "Yet this is what the sovereign Lord says, it will not take place, it will not happen. For the head of Aram is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is only Rezin. Within 65 years, Ephraim will be too shattered to be a people. The head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is only Ramaliah's son." And basically what he's saying there is, you don't have to worry about those little guys. But he still warned Ahaz. He said, if you do not stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all. From there, we go down to verse 14, where we get the first of our three prophecies. God, through Isaiah, gave Ahaz a sign to reassure him that northern Israel and Aram would not succeed in their plans. "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel, God with us." And he further said that the child will be eating curds and honey when he reaches the age of knowing good and evil. And that before he reaches that age, Aram and northern Israel will be destroyed. Then God revealed in verse 17 that the vessel he would use to destroy Aram and northern Israel was the vicious emperor of Assyria, a man known to history as Tiglath-Pileser. Now, when we look at that prophecy of the male child, there are a lot of strange statements. What does it mean that this child will grow up to be eating curds and honey? And what does that have to do with Aram and northern Israel? Well, to make sense of that, we have to look at the following verses 21 through 25. And they state, "In that day a person will keep alive a young cow and 2 goats. And because of the abundance of the milk they give, there will be curds to eat. All who remain in the land will eat curds and honey. In that day, in every place where there are 1,000 vines worth 1,000 silver shekels, there will be only briars and thorns. Hunters will go there with bow and arrow, for the land will be covered with briars and thorns. As for all the hills once cultivated by the hoe, you will no longer go there for fear of the briars and thorns. They will become places where cattle are turned loose and where sheep run." What these verses mean is that when God uses Assyria to destroy northern Israel, it will be so devastating that even agriculture and farming will fail. They will come to an end. The farmlands will be covered with briars and thorns, meaning they will become unfarmable. The cattle will be turned loose in the wild and thus will not be able to provide food for the people. Things will be so bad that a farmer's livestock will consist of just 1 cow and 2 sheep. And of course, he can't kill them for the meat because then he won't have any milk. So they will have an abundance of milk, which turns to curds or butter. And they will have honey because honey is produced in the wild. So God is saying that when he punishes northern Israel through Assyria, the poverty in that land will be so great that there won't be anything to eat but curds and wild honey. Therefore, this child, whose birth is a sign, will grow up in poverty as a result of the destruction of northern Israel. Now, as this declaration about northern Israel and Assyria moves on into chapter 8, we see that there is a second child whom God uses as a feature within the prophecy. And of this second child, God says that before he can even say the words mother or father, the destruction of northern Israel will take place. Now, this second child is not a mysterious figure like the Emmanuel child of chapter 7. We know who this second child is. It's Isaiah's very own son. God told Isaiah to make a baby with his wife and give the baby a name that basically means plunder, so that the child would be a living symbol of God's prophecy concerning Israel and Assyria. And if you read through the writings of the prophets, you'll see that oftentimes prophecy wasn't just preaching and proclaiming, but it also took on some forms of what we might call visual and performance art, such as when God had Jeremiah walk around with the yoke around his neck to symbolize that Judah would be brought under the yoke, that is, under the control of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. So this is what he is also doing with Isaiah's son in chapter 8. He's using him as sort of performance art to symbolize the prophecy concerning northern Israel in order to reassure Judah that God will protect them from northern Israel and Aram. Now again, this is Isaiah's son, not to be confused with the child in chapter 7, who is still a mystery. So chapter 8 continues talking about the destruction of northern Israel, and it concludes saying that they will turn from God completely and be left in darkness and gloom. But then the 9th chapter comes along, and there God starts to bring hope to the situation. This is where we see our second prophecy. God says, starting with verse 1 of chapter 9, that the gloom and darkness that Zebulun and Naphtali experienced will subside. Zebulun and Naphtali, of course, were tribal territories in the northern kingdom. And he says that Galilee, which is another name for that northern region, will go from being distressed to being honored. From verses 2 through 5, he says that those people of northern Israel who walked in darkness will see a great light, that the yoke of oppression will be broken from their necks, and that they will be at war no more. And then in verse 6, he explains why all of this goodness will happen for them. Because unto us a child is born. Unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end, upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to order it and establish it with judgment and justice from that time forward, even forever. So here again, we have this talk of a mysterious child, a son who will be born. Logic tells us that this should be the same son that is spoken of in chapter 7, considering that son's identity was never given outside of the fact that he be called Emmanuel, and he hasn't been mentioned again since. And if indeed it's the same child, then we now have a bit more info about him than what was given in chapter 7. Now we know that he will be a descendant of King David. We know that he will be a king himself because we see that the government shall be upon his shoulders. We know he will be a good king because it says he will be a wonderful counselor, which speaks of him as a just judge. Back then, the king was the highest judge in the land. And we know that he will bring peace because he will be called the Prince of Peace. So verses 6 through 9 explain why the people of the northern territory who walk in darkness will see a great light. Because a wonderful king will come forth offering them peace. Then in chapter 10, God moves on to talk about Assyria. From verses 5 through 11, God is saying, I'm using Assyria to punish northern Israel. But Assyria does not really want to be used by God. Rather, it wants to be this big, ravaging empire, which is not God's will. It wants to take over and destroy all God's people, not just northern Israel, but Judah also, which is why we see Jerusalem mentioned there in those verses. The Assyrians are bad people. So God is willing to use the Assyrians to chastise northern Israel, but he is also going to punish the Assyrians for being bad people and for desiring to do harm to his people. And that goes back to a point that we've been making here for quite some time, which is that God does not use bad people for good. You can't claim that an ungodly person is being used by God to bring about godliness. It doesn't work like that. He may use them, but he is using them for bad. And then he will punish them for being bad right after he uses them. That's how God works. Now, as we read on through chapter 10, we see that after announcing this curse on Assyria, God speaks of the restoration of Israel. In verses 20 through 23, God says he will bring an end to the destruction. Righteousness will overflow in the land, and a remnant of his people will be brought back to Israel. That term remnant means a portion. Not everybody, but a portion of them. The survivors, so to speak. And he's not just talking about northern Israel, because if you read it, you will see that he uses the term Jacob. Remember, Jacob is the father of the Israelite people. So in saying a remnant of Jacob will return, this is a subtle hint that Judah will also go through its own exile and will have to return to the land as well. God has not yet prophesied Judah's exile to Babylon at this point in Isaiah's prophecies, but it is coming. So God is not just speaking of the end of the northern kingdom's oppression, but an end to the oppression of all Israel, after, of course, they have been thoroughly disciplined for their sins. So in chapter 10, God declares that there will be restoration. After all this destruction and exile and oppression, there will be restoration for his people. And that brings us to the prophecy that we see in the opening verses of chapter 11. There shall come forth a rod from the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of its roots. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. That term, stem of Jesse, is actually speaking about King David. Jesse was David's father. So it's saying that this person will be a descendant of David. He'll be a king. And we see that when we go down to verse 10, it says that by the hand of God, this person will bring together the remnant of Israel from all the lands that they have been dispersed in. It says he will be a banner to the Israelite people, meaning they will gather to him and follow him. And also the Gentiles, that is, people from other races and nations, will follow him as well. And with him as king, Ephraim, meaning northern Israel, will not be jealous of Judah, and Judah will not harass northern Israel. In other words, they will no longer fight each other because under this king, this descendant of Jesse and David, they will be united. But there are some things we can see about this king. Remember, we said that logically it would seem that the mysterious child from Isaiah 7 is the same child from Isaiah 9. And Isaiah 9 gives us a little bit more detail about him, mainly that he is a descendant of David and will be a great king. But look what the prophecy in Isaiah 11 says about the king that it speaks of. It says that he is a descendant of Jesse, which means a descendant of David, just like the child in Isaiah 9. It says that he will have the spirit of counsel, and Isaiah 9 calls its king a wonderful counselor. Isaiah 11's king will make righteous judgments, and similarly, Isaiah 9 says its king will judge with justice. Isaiah 11's king will bring peace to Judah and northern Israel, just as Isaiah 9's king is called the Prince of Peace. And finally, we saw in Isaiah 9 that its king will be over the full kingdom of David. And when David ruled, northern and southern Israel were unified. So for Isaiah 9's king to rule over the full kingdom of David, the north and south have to be unified. Well, we see in Isaiah 11 that its king will unify northern Israel and Judah and will rule over them. So with all these direct similarities between the child who will become king in Isaiah 9 and the king who will restore Israel in Isaiah 11, we are left to conclude logically that they are the same person. So with all available evidence, we must logically consider that the child in Isaiah 7 is the same child who will become king in Isaiah 9. And that child who will become king is the very king we see in Isaiah 11. So within this larger 4-chapter long declaration about Judah and northern Israel and Aram and Assyria, we see these 3 smaller prophecies. And when we put these 3 smaller prophecies together, as logic dictates we should, we see a mysterious child born during Israel's oppression who becomes a great king like his forefather David, who brings back the remnant of those whom God punished, who is sought after by the Gentiles, and who rules with justice and peace. Who could this king possibly be? Well, for that answer, you're going to have to wait until next week. But if you need a hint, just look at the title of the message. God bless, and I look forward to next week so we can continue our quest to understand the prophecies.